Hey folks, Nick here from another BookTube channel, and I am wrapping up this wonderful Garb-August with the trashiest, most obscene book in my collection. It's this copy of Nights of Horror, a fetish booklet from 1954. I'm holding it weird because this woman is showing a nipple on the front cover, and I don't want to be driven off of YouTube by the algorithm. There is a crazy history behind this comic series that involves real life murder and violence, and it's all Superman's fault. Yes, that Superman. Allow me to explain. Nights of Horror is a black and white illustrated booklet produced by a company called Malkla. It ran for 16 issues and was reportedly only available in Times Square adult bookstores in New York City. The issues contain prose stories about sexual acts, bondage, torture, and more, with accompanying illustrations. Those illustrations would feature everything from spankings, whippings, voyeurism, and so on. It was very cheaply produced and was clearly only made to generate a quick buck for the publisher. One of the main writers even just recruited his aging broke neighbor, who was an artist, to do the illustrations because he knew that he would work for cheap. Nights of Horror most likely would have faded into obscurity if not for its association with the Brooklyn Thrill Killers. The Brooklyn Thrill Killers was a gang of teenage boys who killed two men in 1954, one by drowning and one by beating. In addition to those murders, they committed various other acts of violence, such as whipping random women on the street and assaulting vagrants, including one who they poured gasoline on and set on fire. They had it in their mind that the streets needed to be cleansed and that they were the ones to do it. The Brooklyn Thrill Killers created a media frenzy and became the poster children for juvenile delinquency in America. Things escalated when Dr. Frederick Wortham, a psychiatric expert and a leading critic against comic books, found out that the teenagers were readers of comics. The teenage gang leader, Jack Koslow, even admitted to buying a whip from an ad in a horror comic. Dr. Wortham then brought Koslow copies of Nights of Horror and asked if these were the types of comics that he enjoyed, to which he answered in the affirmative. It's worth noting that Koslow never specifically said he read Nights of Horror, just that he enjoyed similar comics. Regardless of which comic it was, Wortham saw this as proof that the comics were to blame for the teens' delinquency, and Nights of Horror became the public's #1 target. Wortham was called before the New York State Joint Legislative Committee to study the publication of comics. Horrible title, by the way, to give a testimony where he blamed not just Nights of Horror, but other crime and horror comics as well for rampant juvenile delinquency just in the world. As a result of this testimony, New York Mayor Wagner ordered police to round up all copies of Nights of Horror that they could find in New York City bookstores and destroy them. Under these new obscenity laws, about 2,650 copies of Nights of Horror were seized. Considering the small print run of the publication in the first place, I think it was being printed in a guy's basement in Queens, essentially. It's incredibly difficult to find any copies of any of the 16 issues of this book. I got very, very lucky to find this one, and I am glad to have it in my collection. But I stated at the top of this video that this was all Superman's fault. What did I mean by that? Well, I'll tell you. Nights of Horror, as I've said, contains illustrations by that old broke neighbor who needed the money. That neighbor was none other than Joe Shuster, co-creator of Superman. Despite creating one of the most iconic characters of all time, Shuster was cut off by DC Comics and barely making ends meet, probably further complicated by the fact that his eyesight was also failing. This most likely led to him accepting the offer to work on Nights of Horror, though he refused credit and never told anyone that he worked on it. So that is the history of the most obscene booklet ever published, a publication that was not just banned, but collected and destroyed by order of the New York State government. And I'm sure you're dying to know just how obscene is the material in here. Honestly, it's not that bad at all. I'm pretty sure my 10-year-old nephew has seen worse on YouTube at this point. And the illustrations are pretty good, but they're not like horribly pornographic. I'll cut in some pictures of the interiors here and censor the nips where relevant. The writing is below average, not very good really, and the sex scenes are basically aligned with what you'd find in any trashy romance novel today. This is definitely a case where the story behind the story is a lot more interesting than the story itself. This is just a really wild piece of comics history, and what I told you was just the abridged version. I'll add a link to the article I used for research, which was published by the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, in the description of this video if you want to read more about it. Thank you very much for spending some time with me today, but now it's time to get back to reading.